One of the topics that we like discussing in Fortune and Freedom is the idea of a currency reset. And we've been discussing this at length since we've launched even Fortune and Freedom, so it's been quite a long time. And I've got one of the experts on the topic on this video with me, John Butler. First of all, I should say thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Nick.
I think we've been discussing the same sort of ideas in each other's articles for quite some time now, but we thought it's time to get together and sit down and have a proper chat about it to see where our opinions differ and where we agree, and perhaps we can debate where we differ, even though there's not going to be much difference, I don't think. But let's start off with a broad introduction to the idea of currency resets for those who haven't been following our articles over the last few weeks.
Yes, well, I mean, the basic idea is that history gives you these examples of periods of general economic distress, excessive debt, excessive leverage, and in some cases, in a much simpler economic setting, such as, for example, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. You occasionally simply get a reset of the coinage because there has been some amount of debasement that has taken place through coin clipping or these very old forms of what today we refer to as inflation or devaluation. And what happens, however, is these events, they eventually cause some sort of reset because there's a general loss of faith in the money, and that's extremely disruptive of economic behavior. And even if you're the people in charge, even if you're the ones who were doing the debasement to try and prop up your government, enrich your empire, whatever it is, it gets to the point where the overall economic base that you can tax, the overall amount of resources that you can possibly get your hands on, just begins to decline. And then, of course, something's got to give. Now, in a more modern setting, what you find is that you get these periods of severe inflation or even hyperinflation that result in a new currency being introduced. Sometimes it's a parallel currency. Sometimes it's a completely new currency right from the get-go. And sometimes these are also more subtle processes. That is, it's not kind of a black or white, all or nothing situation. But the point is this: the currency resets that work, the ones that do restore economic stability, do lead to renewed economic prosperity, they all have a few things in common. And I highlighted those things in my article. And they boil down to the things that create trust in whatever new currency regime or outright new currency comes into place. And that's the key to it. What restores trust? And it's usually a combination of several factors.
I think there's so many different things going on there. To me, the basics to understand all of this comes along with the idea that the world tends to have a reserve currency. So you've mentioned there that there's a lot of currency resets that have happened over time. Sometimes that's because a particular nation completely mismanages its currency and therefore has to have a currency reset as a nation. But I think the one that we're focusing on, both of us, is the idea that the international reserve currency, the currency that is used as a common currency globally, is the one that's reset. So currently in our current reserve system, we have the US dollar as that reserve currency. But going out right back through history, we have had reserve currencies often. And because of the situation created by having a reserve currency, you get these buildups of imbalances, usually trade imbalances. And eventually those reach some sort of peak. And that's when you get a currency reset that affects everyone and affects the global economy effectively. And that's the one that you focus on when you say that usually there's some sort of reversion back to gold, because whichever nation had the global reserve currency status is no longer trusted.
Indeed. And gold has played arguably the single most important role historically, not only as money generally, but as the focus of the reset. That is, if you're going to try and reset your coinage, as it were, if going way back, then you needed to come up with a new agreement regarding the standard weight measure of the coinage so that it would be generally and universally accepted for commerce. And if you can't get that right, and if people won't trust that the coinage is stable, that the coins aren't being clipped, for example, then it's not going to work. Nowadays, of course, the dollar is a fiat currency. It's not backed by gold. It hasn't been backed even in principle by gold since 1973. And so you have a unique situation where, yes, you have a global reserve currency, but it's the first time historically that the global reserve currency isn't backed by anything. And so this leads to a lot of head scratching. If you are a monetary and economic and financial historian such as myself, there's no obvious and immediate answer for how you would reset under these conditions. However, we do know that we still need to find a way to restore trust. And therefore, there are several proposals that have been discussed, in some cases for years, regarding how that might be done at the global level with a dollar fiat reserve standard, basically well past its shelf life at this point. And that's what, it's a number of people have written about this. I've written about it. Jim Rickards has written about it. You and I have written about it and discussed it most recently in our series. And one possibility, of course, that you bring up, that Jim brings up, and that I brought up, is that some sort of World Bank / IMF SDR, or standard drawing right, might be mooted and proposed, and kind of already has been, as a possible dollar replacement as part of a reset.
So let's take a step back before we get to that, because I want to ask you. You mentioned how the US dollar reserve system is reaching a point where it's looking a bit absurd, because those imbalances that I mentioned earlier are just getting too big. The trade deficit is getting too big. There's too much debt. The euro dollar system and all of that sort of stuff is indicating that we're at the end of this current system's, I guess, where the shelf life is going to expire. How do you think that gets triggered, this acknowledging of the US dollar's reserve status as being expired?
It's hard to know precisely what will cause it. Now, I present several possibilities in my book regarding how this could happen. Some would be quite disruptive and surprising, others far less disruptive, and indeed, if done properly, wouldn't necessarily cause any major disruption to global economic activity, wouldn't crash financial markets, right? None of it. But history suggests, sadly, that doing something like this, the risk of it being at least somewhat disorderly for some amount of time, sadly, that's probably what we have to expect. And really, the trigger is most likely to be some sort of spat on some or multiple critical issues between the United States and its major trading partners. Those trading partners would almost certainly include China and Russia, and they would probably also include some number of major oil and other commodity producing countries, and possibly also your most competitive major exporters, not only China, but including Japan and Germany. Now that's potentially actually quite a long list of countries who would see it in their own national self-interest to try and move away from this system where they're effectively forced to accumulate unbacked dollar instruments, which are increasingly zero yielding or overvalued in some way fundamentally. They'd love to be able to get away from that, but it's not that easy. Again, how do you do this in a way that isn't disruptive? How do you do this in a way that does not result in your export markets weakening? How do you do it in a way that introduces a new international reserve currency, but leaves the existing global economy, trade patterns, et cetera, more or less intact, or leads only to gradual change over time that doesn't lead to a massive global recession, say? No one knows how to do that. That's the problem. It's not that it doesn't need to be done. No one knows how to do it. And if no one knows how to do it, how are a dozen or more countries going to agree how to do it in concert? In a way, this is why the Bretton Woods Conference was called in 1944. I mean, no one just knew what the best solution was to a couple decades of international monetary mayhem, the 20s and the 30s. No one really knew But they all got together, they came up with a plan, and actually that plan worked pretty well for a multi-decade period of time. Something like that may be attempted this time around.
It strikes me that a pandemic is a pretty good opportunity to have this sort of conference, ironically enough, and to get together and figure out what we're going to do next. But let's move on to the SDR that you've raised. In my book, moving away from the US dollar and to the SDR, the IMF's SDR, would be a form of currency reset because it would change how the financial system and the global trading system works. Under your definition, which is a bit more strict, that's just another fudge, correct? It's just another version of the current system, really, and it's also going to run into the same problems.
What the SDR is today is strictly a unit of account for the supranational Bretton Woods, originally financial institutions of the World Bank and the IMF. But it has been mooted that you could turn the SDR into an actual currency. The IMF indeed has proposed as much. That is, the IMF could become the global central bank, and it would manage the SDR money supply, where that money supply would be determined basically by the voting shares in the SDR basket, which would include the dollar, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, the euro, and the pound sterling. And based on those voting shares, there would be some process whereby an actual decision would be made month to month, quarter to quarter, however it was done, to set interest rates, or as things stand today, implement some form of quantitative easing where money is issued and then the sovereign bonds of the participating countries are bought as the assets offsetting that monetary base. The same way, for example, the European Central Bank operates today. Now, that said, it's kind of disputed what the ECB gets up to, because they're supposed to respect proportionality across the participating Euro member states when acquiring assets. And they have strayed from that in recent years. And indeed, there is this ongoing court case in Germany claiming that violates the ECB charter, and that they need to stop having what they claim is a disproportionate buying of sovereign assets in favor of Italy, Spain, and a few others. In any event, that's the idea. The idea is you take this international bureaucracy appointed by the member governments in the IMF, in the SDR, and they set global monetary policy. And basically, national currencies are then either fixed to that strictly, or they're allowed to fluctuate within bands, or they're allowed to depreciate at some agreed maximum rate over time. Many variations of this have been discussed. And indeed, some people have looked at this in quite a lot of detail, looking at the history of the European exchange rate mechanism, the history of currency boards, other arrangements whereby multiple currencies are linked or anchored in some way to one another. And they made some very specific proposals for how this could be done at the global level with a future SDR currency basket with a global central bank as the sort of global anchor, as it were. And so something like this may well be attempted. There's a lot of people behind it. A lot of people see this as a way to wean the global monetary system away from this dollar-centric system, which no longer represents well the distribution of global economic power that has changed very dramatically in recent decades.
The part that I emphasize in all of this, which brings it back to investment, financial markets, and financial trends, is that we need some sort of global reserve currency, some sort of agreed upon exchange. Currently, it's the US dollar. Historically, it's often reverted to gold. But no matter which particular system you choose, it creates some side effects, some problems, and some financial trends. So, for example, if the US dollar is your global reserve currency, that means the US can run persistent trade deficits and basically exchange printed money for real goods, and that creates an imbalance. If you have a system of fixed exchange rates, then the exchange rates don't rebalance the economies. If you have an SDR-based system, it creates the need for a global central bank with global interest rates, just as the euro has created that same need. So no matter which system they choose, and there's a number of different ways of doing this that we've used historically, it creates a new trend, well, not just one, many different trends in financial markets, which are predictable. So, for example, if we were to go back to gold, which is one of the reasons you advocate, the point I'm about to make is one of the reasons you advocate for it, is that it would force fiscal responsibility onto governments. And I think that's one of the strengths of gold right now. It's also one of the reasons why governments will avoid gold, why they will not particularly appreciate the idea of going back to some sort of gold-backed global reserve currency, or gold as the reserve currency. So that, I think, is the main reason why SDRs are very likely, because as you've just explained, it creates the system that is most manipulable for the international politicians and policymakers at places like the IMF. They can have the most influence, and they can interfere in each other's economies at a supranational level to the most out of all of the different systems. But that system again has the same problem that the ERM had, the Plaza Agreement had, the Smithsonian, all of these attempts to have fixed exchange rates. And my question to you is, do you think that people will go along with the idea of fixed exchange rates, which are implied by the SDR reset, also by the gold reset? Do you think people will go along with that, given how badly it affected everyone starting in the 70s, but going right through to the 90s?
Well, as you say, no government wants to give up the printing press. No government wants to be forced to follow prudent fiscal policies, right? I mean, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily abuse it badly, but governments want the flexibility. If they want to spend more money, they want to be able to do that and to finance it at low interest rates. And so that's what is in everyone's interest. But when it comes to international trade, that's not a stable equilibrium, because if everybody is simply printing money to keep its own economy growing and competitive and whatnot vis-a-vis the rest of the world, then no one's going to be able to really trade with each other, and you're going to end up with global autarky, chaos. So if you're going to have healthy international trade, and let's face it, we live in a globalized world where you can't even begin to imagine what things would be like if trade barriers started springing up everywhere. If you want to still be able to take advantage of the merits of globalization, a huge integrated global workforce, relatively free movement of labor and capital, etc. If you want to be able to realize those advantages, you are going to have to be able to agree on some sort of monetary stability at the international level. And you're absolutely right. Historical attempts to do this, they pretty much always fail in the end. They might work for a period of time, but eventually you get to some sort of dispute. Someone thinks their currency is overvalued and they try to weaken it, and others resist that and say, no, we're going to print more of our own currency. And then you get into this so-called race to the bottom where everyone is devaluing against everyone else, and it blows up. But this is why the SDR might be attempted. You might have a lot of buy-in. You might have a lot of cooperation, at least initially, but then just you wait. Some dispute's going to come along. Someone's going to want to print a lot more. Someone's not going to want to print a lot more. And it's going to be an unstable equilibrium. This is why I think that while an SDR regime might well be attempted, and it might work, at least provide a reasonable degree of international monetary stability for a multi-year period, I nevertheless think it will collapse and be replaced by something which is at least partially, if not entirely, gold-backed. Keep in mind what happened when Bretton Woods blew up in 1971 through 73. When Nixon closed the gold window, it was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure. And indeed, there was dialogue. There were discussions regarding how the US would devalue vis-a-vis the rest of the world, and then fixed exchange rates would be reset, and everything would be relinked to gold. It was all seen as just a temporary adjustment to Bretton Woods. But by 1973, as you mentioned, the Smithsonian Agreement, basically that agreement was agreeing to disagree, kind of. It was saying, okay, look, we can't really agree how to fully reset the system, and so we're just going to kind of fudge it a bit here. And look, by the end of the 1970s, nobody was even pretending that there were fixed exchange rates anymore. There was no attempt. And then you get into the history of the Plaza Accord and the Louvre Accord and these things. But the point is this: you never really got back then to a sound monetary footing. The imbalances have simply grown and grown and grown ever since. The US has run chronic trade deficits. The accumulated net foreign debt position of the United States is now enormous. As a percentage of GDP, it is such a large figure that in order to reset that imbalance, the US would have to devalue very substantially. I've done some calculations here. It's something like the trade-weighted dollar would have to decline by 30 to 40% to restore balance vis-a-vis the rest of the world. That's a huge devaluation, and it's almost inconceivable that that could happen without the US dollar losing its preeminent reserve status. But the same problem would persist with an SDR. It wouldn't make it go away, and it would be very hard for countries to agree how to manage it. And so I think ultimately it would fail, and then people would look around for an alternative to the SDR, and there's only one left, and that's gold. The one currency that can't be manipulated, the one currency that's objective no matter where you go, the true international money that no one can print, that favors no nation over another. It simply favors the economically competitive over the economically not competitive. And it forces the not competitive to get more competitive if they want to continue to prosper in a globalized, integrated economy. But that's good. Discipline is good. Competitiveness is good. We all benefit from it. That's where I think we ultimately get to, but there will be some bumps along the road.
Not everyone wants to live in an economy that has to be competitive, and politicians love to use that wind in their sails. We had an excellent email from a reader who I've missed the email. I should have had it in front of me now, but he suggested combining these two ideas instead. The idea that gold is in the SDR. So tell us, what's your answer to that email? I know you've seen it and you've been thinking about your reply, so let's have it here.
Well, this has also been proposed. The idea is you move to an SDR-backed system, but one with gold as a component of the SDR. And in fact, this was suggested by US Trade Representative Robert Zoellick in the early 2000s. It's also been suggested by Lord Desai, who I believe is chairman emeritus of the London School of Economics, very, very prestigious economist and policy advisor. And the official monetary and financial institutions forum, which is kind of a global central bankers think tank, they published a report suggesting precisely this, that the way forward is an SDR-backed system, but with a substantial gold component as part of the SDR basket, because it provides an important stabilizing force and it implies a certain sort of basket anchor reference point for the overall SDR. And that's an intriguing idea. And indeed, maybe that's the grand compromise that we're going to see over the coming years. That is not just moving away from the dollar towards an SDR type global currency system, but one that explicitly includes gold. Now, even so, I think that would ultimately prove unstable, because whenever a country got into trouble with its own financing, they would still want to devalue versus that basket, and others would resist that. And everyone ends up devaluing versus gold anyway. And if everyone's devaluing versus gold, well, then at some point, again, that needs to be reset. And what was a gold component in the SDR just becomes gold. And that's indeed, it's kind of funny. That's actually how the international gold standard, the classical international gold standard, kind of got going back in the 19th century. It was actually a failure to cooperate in monetary affairs at the global level. Most major economies were still bimetallic. That is, they used both gold and silver as money back in the 19th century. But there were some disputes at the international level about whether silver could still be used to settle trade imbalances or not. And the issue kind of came to a head, and gold displaced silver at the international level, inaugurating what became the classical gold standard, a monetary regime that actually lasted quite a long time. and underpinned tremendous economic prosperity. So I think that's where we are eventually going again. But precisely how we get there is an open question, and it could well be some blend of an SDR and gold will provide an interim step, possibly for a period of many years. But I still think gold ultimately triumphs in the end.
Here's what worries me about the whole topic we're discussing, and it's the age-old battle between whether these things should be determined at the government national level or whether it should be some sort of international, supranational organization level. And I think going back to gold and gold-backed um, gold as the reserve currency means that no nation has control. It goes down to each individual's nation's responsibilities to be fiscally prudent and have good trade policy on so forth. Or we've got this SDR idea of the wise council of unelected leaders controlling our global economy and the trade imbalances and what reweightings happen when, and it's just more skullduggery at levels that are not democratically accountable, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, the distribution of power um, economically is ultimately going to determine the distribution of power politically and militarily. I mean, you can't expect to be a major global power in economic or political terms or military terms um, if you don't have that fundamental sustainable economic strength. It's not a stable, lasting situation. And so, if you look at the distribution of global economic power, um, you do have a number of countries that clearly fundamentally disagree or would disagree about how to do something like this because again you have your chronic importers like the US and the UK and your chronic exporters like China and Germany and to a lesser extent Japan. Trying to align interests here is very, very difficult. I mean, it probably is doable, but it's very difficult. So even if you do get a supranational body such as the IMF administering an international currency such as the SDR, perhaps one with a gold component, you're still going to be getting disputes. I mean, it's not going to go away. So this idea that it becomes a purely top-down affair, I think is unlikely. And even in the euro area, where you have the ECB having been in place now for a long time, and prior to that was preceded by the European Monetary Institute and the European Exchange Rate Mechanism. You have multiple generations of Europeans who've grown up accepting that the EU should have a degree of power. Nevertheless, you still get major fundamental disputes within the EU between national governments and the EU bureaucracy itself. And those are never going to go away on any reasonable time horizon. And in fact, if anything, they've become worse and more intense over the past decade. And again, Germany itself, a sizable number of Germans support challenging the constitutionality of how the ECB is conducting monetary policy. This is not going to go away. So while I think we do have reason to fear supranational entities because they can seem very unaccountable, nevertheless, the distribution of global power is such that national governments will still matter a lot. And if they can't agree, well, then it's going to be very limited what that supranational entity can do because they're simply going to lack a mandate. And you're seeing this play out in real time with the ECB. Imagine had Germany not been involved. Imagine had the Bundesbank not repeatedly voiced its concerns about what the ECB has been doing with its quantitative easing, buying of corporate securities, so on and so forth. They might have gotten even way more radical, right? I mean, the ECB might have run much, much farther, much, much faster in terms of printing money, devaluing the euro, had Germany and a handful of other countries not been telling them, wait a minute, we don't think you should be doing this. So whatever. I mean, I myself am concerned about relatively or seemingly unaccountable supranational bureaucracies, absolutely. But the realities of the distribution of economic power in the world suggest that there's a lot of competition out there. And so I don't think you're going to get just some top-down diktat currency management for the world going forward.
One thing we can fairly safely say is that the US is about to be knocked off a pedestal and it's going to hurt. What do you think that means for financial assets and investments in the US?
Well, I've been saying this for several years now. I believe that US assets are simply fundamentally overvalued versus the rest of the world in general. Now, of course, there are other pockets of relative overvaluation out there. But the US, if you take a look at traditional measures such as price earnings ratios, CAPE ratios, enterprise value to EBITDA ratios, there are many different ways, Tobin skew, there are many different ways to value equity markets. And the US looks very overvalued vis-a-vis most of the rest of the world. Now, I think there are reasons for that overvaluation. Some of them have to do with this belief that the US is simply a safer jurisdiction, the belief that the US is simply a more fundamentally competitive and flexible economy, belief that the US dollar simply will remain the reserve, and so the US will keep getting that low interest rate benefit by being held as a reserve currency. I think all three of those assumptions are wrong. We've discussed the latter one already, that is that the dollar is ultimately going to lose its preeminent reserve status. But what about the other two? Well, okay, the US certainly has a free market capitalist legacy, but where are we today? I mean, the average tax rate in the US is no longer significantly lower than average tax rates in Europe. The size of the US public sector is no longer significantly lower than the size of the public sector in many European countries. What used to be a big difference 25, 30 years ago is not a big difference anymore. So this idea that there's a big qualitative difference between the US on the one hand and other developed economies on the other just isn't true. And indeed, when you start looking to Asia, you have economies now with per capita incomes that are essentially the same as the US. I mean, if you look at Japan and a handful of other places, there's just not much in it anymore. And yet, they're more competitive. They're exporting, and the U.S. is not. So this idea that the U.S. should be fundamentally overvalued because it's somehow just a better, more competitive economy is simply not true anymore. And that realization may only happen when the dollar itself begins to lose its luster at the international level. So not only is the dollar potentially needing to devalue 30 or 40% vis-a-vis the rest of the world to ultimately settle these imbalances, but US assets are also going to have to underperform. And you really don't want to be overweight US assets in that sort of environment.
I agree, and I think the thing to emphasize there is that it's about the direction of change and the rate of change. So the Americans are becoming less, I suppose, fiscally responsible, less exporting, less all the things that you'd look for in a safe haven for your capital. Whereas Asia and lots of other places, even if they are less safe and less capitalist than the US, currently the direction of change is clearly towards what the US claims to be. John, thanks for joining us, and thanks for joining us at home.